Cookie Hood, a former war correspondent for CBS News, has a new podcast called Journalista, where she shares her life story. The podcast primarily focuses on her experiences as a war correspondent in Nicaragua in the 1980s, but also delves into her previous life as a model in New York City and her involvement with the cartel. Cookie Hood's life has been anything but ordinary. She shares that she has always been drawn to the seedy and dangerous side of life, and her upbringing and education have given her the privilege and connections to navigate these worlds. After her career as a model in New York City, she moved to Nicaragua to cover the revolution as a journalist. She quickly became one of the top war correspondents, working with CBS News and covering the civil war between the Sandinistas and the Contras. Hood was one of the key figures in breaking the Iran-Contra scandal. She had exclusive access to Nicaraguan officials, which allowed her to uncover the illegal activities of the U.S. government in funding the Contras. She explains that the U.S. government sold arms to Iran and used the proceeds to fund the Contras, and later made deals with drug dealers to continue funding the rebel forces. Hood talks about her involvement in the Iran-Contra scandal and how she helped 60 Minutes interview Eugene Hasenfuss, a cargo handler who survived after his plane was shot down by the Sandinistas. She describes her role in bringing the story to the public and her efforts to expose the U.S. government's involvement in funding the Contras in Nicaragua. She reveals that she interviewed a man who confessed to working for the CIA, despite the CIA denying any knowledge of him. The man had evidence, including a Swiss bank account number, which Hood was able to verify. This led to congressional hearings and the revelation that $30 million had been accrued, with $18 million missing, which had been used to fund the Contras. As a war correspondent, Hood covered the brutal realities of war, including witnessing the deaths of civilians, torture, and other atrocities. She describes losing her faith after encountering piles of dead bodies and the senseless killing and violence that she witnessed during her time in Nicaragua. Hood explains that the conflict in Nicaragua was a civil war, with the Sandinistas and the Contras being Nicaraguans fighting against each other. She highlights the personal and ideological motivations behind the conflict, with the Contras being primarily motivated by financial gain, while the Sandinistas were fighting for ideological reasons, including helping the poor and marginalized in the country. Hood discusses the U.S. government's involvement in funding the Contras and the impact of proxy wars in the region. She explains that the U.S. initially supported the Sandinistas until they began implementing social programs to help the poor, which led to the U.S. withdrawing support and the Sandinistas turning to Russia and Cuba for assistance. Hood shares harrowing experiences from her time as a war correspondent, including surviving a helicopter crash while on a reporting trip in Nicaragua. She describes the intense moments leading up to the crash, the heroic actions of the soldiers who saved her, and the subsequent rescue by the Sandinistas, which ultimately saved her life. Hood recounts her experiences during the Sandinista revolution in Nicaragua. She describes a party where Sandinistas took hostages, including her relatives, and how she and her friends were mistaken for Sandinistas and taken to prison by Somoza guardsmen. She also shares her encounter with President Ortega, who was a political prisoner at the time. Hood discusses the killing of journalist Bill Stewart by Somoza guardsmen during the revolution. She explains how the footage of the killing changed the public perspective in the U.S. and led to a shift in support from Somoza to the Sandinistas. She also shares her belief that the murder of a Nicaraguan editor was a covert operation orchestrated by Somoza's son. Hood also shares her connections to drug traffickers, including her friendship with Pablo Escobar and her interactions with the Ochoa brothers. She reveals that she was able to maintain these relationships due to her trustworthiness and discretion. Hood discusses the origins of her podcast, Journalista, and how it came about after meeting her partner, Steve Estep, who was initially skeptical of her stories. However, after presenting him with a box of evidence, he was convinced and they began working on the podcast. The podcast has received rave reviews and has been widely successful, with Hood sharing her incredible life stories in each episode.